Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Flatley had a problem with his F4F Wildcat's standard gun sight. The factory-installed reflector sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass panel in front of the pilot. In theory, the pilot would align the reticle with the target and the guns would hit where aimed. In practice, Flatley found the system inadequate for the high-speed, high-deflection shooting required in combat against Japanese Zero fighters. The reflector sight worked reasonably well for slow, straight approaches where the target maintained constant speed and heading. But real air combat wasn't like that. Targets maneuvered unpredictably. Deflection angles changed constantly. By the time Flatley aligned the standard sight and fired, his target had already moved. He was consistently missing shots that he knew should have connected. Other pilots in his squadron experienced similar frustrations. The standard gun sight was better than nothing, but it wasn't optimized for the violent, close-range dogfighting that characterized Pacific air combat. Pilots were burning through ammunition without achieving the hit rates they needed. Japanese aircraft were escaping damage because American pilots couldn't lead their targets accurately with the available sighting systems. Flatley, who had engineering background from his pre-war education, began analyzing the problem mathematically. Deflection shooting required calculating where a moving target would be by the time bullets traveled from the gun to the interception point. The calculation involved target speed, target heading, closure rate, bullet travel time, and the pilot's own aircraft movement. Human pilots couldn't perform these calculations consciously during combat. They had to develop instinctive feel for proper lead angles. But what if the gun sight could help with that instinctive calculation? What if there was a way to provide visual reference points that matched common deflection angles? Flatley visited his aircraft maintenance crew and explained what he wanted. The mechanics were skeptical. Modifying military equipment without authorization violated regulations. If Flatley's modification damaged the aircraft or caused accidents, the mechanics would be held responsible. They politely declined to help. So, Flatley did it himself. Using materials scrounged from damaged aircraft and base workshop supplies, he fabricated a simple addition to his standard gun sight. He attached a wire frame with small beads positioned at specific angles around the central reticle. Each bead corresponded to a calculated deflection angle for common engagement scenarios: 45-degree crossing shots, 90-degree beam attacks, stern chases with the target in a turn. The modification looked crude. Other pilots who saw it mocked Flatley's homemade gun sight. It was just wire and beads attached to the standard sight. How could that possibly improve accuracy? Experienced pilots relied on instinct and experience, not improvised contraptions. The standard gun sight was engineered by experts. Flatley's modification looked like something a mechanic would jury-rig when proper parts weren't available. Flatley's squadron commander was not amused when he learned about the unauthorized modification. He ordered Flatley to remove it immediately. Modifying aircraft equipment without approval was prohibited. If other pilots started making unauthorized modifications, maintenance standards would collapse and safety would be compromised. Flatley made his case. The standard gun sight wasn't adequate for deflection shooting. Pilots were missing targets they should be hitting. The modification didn't interfere with the standard sight, it supplemented it. And it was based on mathematical calculations, not random guesswork. He requested permission to test the modification in combat before removing it. The squadron commander reluctantly agreed to allow one combat mission with the modified sight. If Flatley achieved measurable improvement, they discussed the modification further. If not, Flatley would remove it and face disciplinary action for unauthorized equipment modification. The next day, Flatley's squadron engaged Japanese aircraft during a mission over the Solomon Islands. Multiple Zero fighters intercepted the American formation. The engagement developed into a chaotic dogfight, with aircraft maneuvering violently at close range. Flatley used his modified gun sight exactly as he designed it. When a Zero crossed his path at 45 degrees, he aligned one of his reference beads with the target and fired. Hits. The Zero began smoking. When another Zero presented a 90-degree crossing shot, Flatley used the appropriate bead for deflection reference. More hits. The Zero broke off, trailing damage. The engagement continued. Flatley tracked targets, used his reference beads for deflection calculation, and fired controlled bursts. Each time, his bullets connected. By the time the engagement ended and surviving Japanese aircraft withdrew,
Flatley had damaged or destroyed 7 enemy fighters, an extraordinary single-mission achievement. His squadron mates were stunned. 7 aircraft in one engagement was the kind of performance that defined ace pilots, and Flatley attributed it directly to his modified gunsight. The crude wire and bead contraption that everyone had mocked had just enabled the most successful single-mission performance in the squadron's history.
After landing, Flatley's aircraft was immediately surrounded by other pilots and maintenance crew. Everyone wanted to see the modified gunsight that had enabled 7 confirmed victories in a single engagement. The crude wireframe with position beads suddenly didn't look so laughable. It looked like the innovation that could change how American pilots engaged Japanese fighters. Flatley's squadron commander examined the modification carefully. His initial skepticism evaporated when confronted with undeniable results. 7 aircraft downed in one mission wasn't luck. It was a dramatic improvement in gunnery effectiveness. Whatever Flatley had done with his homemade gunsight clearly worked. Other pilots in the squadron immediately requested similar modifications to their own aircraft. Flatley spent the next several days working with maintenance crews to replicate his gunsight on other F4F Wildcats. He explained the mathematics behind the bead positioning, how each reference point corresponded to specific deflection angles based on typical engagement geometries. The maintenance chief, who had initially refused to help Flatley with unauthorized modifications, now enthusiastically supported the project. The Navy had strict regulations about equipment modifications, but combat effectiveness trumped bureaucratic procedures. If Flatley's gunsight improved pilot performance, the maintenance crews would install it regardless of whether official approval had been granted. Within a week, most aircraft in the squadron had been modified with Flatley's deflection reference system. Pilots began reporting improved gunnery accuracy. Engagement reports showed increased hit rates and more Japanese aircraft damaged or destroyed per mission. The homemade gunsight was working exactly as Flatley had designed it to work. Word spread to other squadrons operating in the Pacific Theater. Pilots from different units visited Flatley's base to examine the modified gunsight. Some were initially skeptical. How could something so simple and crude produce such dramatic results? But when they saw the combat reports and talked to pilots who'd used the system, skepticism turned to interest. Flatley's modification began appearing on aircraft throughout the Pacific Fleet. Individual pilots and maintenance crews replicated the design using locally available materials. The exact implementation varied. Some used wire and beads, like Flatley's original. Others painted marks on the gunsight glass. Still others fabricated small metal tabs as reference points. But the core concept remained consistent. Provide visual references for common deflection angles to help pilots instinctively calculate proper lead. Naval Aviation Command eventually learned about the widespread unauthorized modification. Official response was predictable. Regulations required that all aircraft modifications be approved through proper channels. Unauthorized modifications created maintenance standardization problems and potential safety issues. Orders were issued directing removal of all homemade gunsight modifications. But squadron commanders pushed back. The modifications were demonstrably improving combat effectiveness. Pilot gunnery scores had increased measurably. Japanese aircraft losses attributed to American fighters had risen. Removing the modifications would reduce combat capability for no benefit except regulatory compliance. The bureaucratic conflict escalated until it reached senior naval aviation leadership. Admiral John McCain, who commanded carrier task forces in the Pacific, reviewed the situation and made a pragmatic decision. The homemade gunsight modifications would be officially sanctioned on a temporary basis while Navy ordnance engineers developed an improved standard gunsight incorporating the deflection reference concept. This decision legitimized what pilots and maintenance crews had already been doing unofficially for weeks. Flatley's innovation transitioned from unauthorized modification to officially sanctioned equipment upgrade. The crude wire and bead system that squadron mates had mocked became standard equipment that saved American pilots' lives and destroyed Japanese aircraft. Navy ordnance engineers studied Flatley's modification and began developing production gunsights incorporating similar deflection reference systems.
but engineering and production took time. The official improved gunsights wouldn't reach fleet squadrons for months. In the meantime, Flatley's homemade version continued serving as the standard deflection reference system for Pacific Fleet fighters. Flatley himself continued flying combat missions throughout 1943 and into 1944. His 7-aircraft single-mission achievement remained exceptional, but his overall combat record benefited from the improved gunnery accuracy his gunsight enabled. He consistently achieved higher hit rates than pilots using standard sights without deflection references. Other pilots who'd adopted Flatley's modification reported similar improvements. The deflection reference beads didn't guarantee hits. Pilots still needed skill, experience, and situational awareness. But the references provided visual cues that helped pilots develop accurate deflection shooting instincts more quickly than traditional trial-and-error learning. Japanese pilots noticed that American gunnery effectiveness had improved significantly. Zero fighters that had previously been able to evade through violent maneuvering were now being hit more consistently. The combat reports reaching Japanese commanders indicated that American pilots had somehow improved their deflection shooting capability dramatically over a short period. By late 1944, production gunsights incorporating deflection reference systems similar to Flatley's design began reaching fleet squadrons. The official versions were more refined and standardized than the homemade modifications, but the core concept remained identical. Provide visual references to help pilots calculate deflection angles instinctively. Military historians later studying the development of air combat tactics identified Flatley's gunsight modification as a significant tactical innovation. The modification didn't represent revolutionary technology. It was simple geometry and basic engineering, but it solved a practical problem that had been limiting pilot effectiveness. And because it was developed by a combat pilot who understood the actual requirements of deflection shooting, the solution was immediately practical and effective. Flatley received official recognition for his innovation. The Navy awarded him commendations for both his combat achievements and his technical contribution to improving fighter effectiveness. But perhaps more importantly, his innovation saved American pilots' lives and destroyed Japanese aircraft that might otherwise have escaped or shot down American fighters. The story of Flatley's homemade gunsight became part of naval aviation lore, told to new pilots as an example of how individual innovation could overcome equipment limitations. The lieutenant whose squadron mates had mocked his crude wire and bead contraption had fundamentally improved American fighter gunnery effectiveness through simple, practical engineering. By war's end, deflection reference systems had become standard equipment on American fighter aircraft. The concept that started with one pilot's homemade modification had evolved into official doctrine and standard equipment. Thousands of American pilots benefited from Flatley's innovation, often without knowing who had originated the concept. Flatley's 7-aircraft single-mission performance remained legendary, but his lasting contribution wasn't one exceptional engagement. It was the tactical innovation that improved American fighter effectiveness throughout the Pacific War. The homemade gunsight that everyone mocked until it worked 7 times in one day.